So in the 1960s and 70s, jazz took elements of rock and funk music, specifically the rhythms and the electric instruments, to create fusion, on which I have a separate video. Now, the success of jazz rock fusion prompted other musicians to try and merge jazz with other genres of music. Musicians and record labels realized that by fusing jazz with other genres, they can make it more listenable and thus expose jazz to a wider audience. In other words, they realized that they can make money from jazz. So in the late 1970s and 1980s, a second wave of musicians began combining jazz with various other genres to create a whole bunch of subgenres of jazz. These include things like jazz funk, which combines jazz and funk, pop jazz, which combines jazz and pop, new age jazz, which combines jazz with kind of ambient meditation, easy listening lounge music, world jazz or ethno jazz, which combines jazz with world music, so essentially folk music from other countries, and smooth jazz, which combines jazz, pop and R&B. Now, because these subgenres all aim to combine jazz with one or more other musical genres, these terms are actually quite vague, and there's a lot of overlap between these genres. There's not much difference between, say, pop jazz and smooth jazz. So you'll find that many artists straddle across many of these subgenres. And for this reason, all these post-1980s subgenres of jazz are often lumped together and called contemporary jazz or crossover jazz. This is simply jazz music that tries to merge with another genre of music in order to be more commercially successful. So they are crossing over from jazz to another genre and from a niche genre to a commercially successful genre. So in order to be more listenable and appeal to a wider audience, crossover jazz tends to be, well, less jazzy. Instead of playing jazz standards, smooth jazz musicians often played over contemporary pop songs. But it still does use some jazzy ideas and techniques. It'll use seventh chords, maybe with a natural ninth or 13th added occasionally. You will find some slash chords and some suspended chords. You will find the use of modes and pentatonic scales and blues scales. You may come across a quartal chord every now and then. And the pianist may take the harmony and use it to comp or to play a vamp. The melody may use anticipation. You may even see a few 2-5-1s. And this crossover jazz can be played with a swing rhythm or a straight rhythm, and there will still be some syncopation. But you're not going to see anything too out there or too dissonant or too chromatic. You're not, for example, going to see very many tone clusters or heavily altered chords. So you won't see, say, a G7 sharp 5 flat 9 sharp 11 flat 13 chord, for example. You also won't see very many complex chord substitutions or heavily chromatic or atonal soloing, or very many exotic scales like diminished or augmented scales. So unlike jazz rock fusion, which was actually quite adventurous and quite chromatic, quite polytonal and polyrhythmic, crossover jazz is in comparison quite safe. It tends to avoid anything that sounds unpleasant or dissonant or wrong. For this reason, crossover or smooth jazz solos tend to use short and sparse phrases, use a lot of repetition and sequences. They tend to be quite consonant and smooth, naturally, and they tend to move by step a lot, which sounds much more melodic and lyrical. Or if you do get a larger jump in one direction, say up, this is generally followed by a stepwise melody down afterwards in the opposite direction. And very often you'll see long notes, especially at the beginning of phrases. Now, most importantly, crossover jazz, much like fusion before it, generally takes the rhythm of the other musical genre. So whereas traditional jazz has that swung eighth note or triplet feel, and fusion may use that eighth note rock feel, crossover jazz may borrow from funk or R&B and have that nice and funky 16th note feel. Now, one of the earliest examples of crossover jazz is George Benson's version of Breezin'. This song just uses a simple 1-6-2-5 progression in D on repeat over and over again through the whole song. In the recorded version, you'll hear gentle violins and woodwind instruments in the background throughout the entire song. It's got a really slick R&B 16th note beat, and the whole song lasts for about 5 minutes and 40 seconds in total, but the solo only lasts about 1.5 minutes. And it's pretty safe and pleasant, mostly diatonic, but with a little bit of bluesiness. So overall, if you listen to the recording, it's quite nice and pleasant and sweet and saccharine and safe. Now, to demonstrate this, I'll jump onto my guitar and I'll play a version of this song, Breezin', for you right now. So naturally, the question that arises is this actually jazz? And the answer obviously depends on your definition of jazz. If you think jazz is about virtuosity and pushing the limits and complexity and dissonance and playing jazz standards and being moody and raw and bluesy and playing with a swing rhythm, then no, this is not jazz. Improvising over a few triads using a major scale for 20 seconds doesn't make it a jazz song. You could argue that a lot of the songs in this style are really instrumental pop music. But on the other hand, many of the jazz standards we all now play were actually just pop songs written for Broadway by people like Gershwin, Porter and Berlin. and swing music was the pop music of the early 20th century. So what's wrong with updating the repertoire and playing modern pop songs like the ones you hear on the radio? And indeed, some genres of jazz like hard bop and soul jazz are relatively simplistic. They're not overly complex genres of jazz. Is that a problem? Further, jazz has always borrowed elements from other genres of music, whether it be soul or R&B or blues or funk or rock or classical, or Afro-Cuban or bossa nova. Is there any reason it can't also borrow from pop or easy listening music? And of course, there's plenty of jazz genres that play with a straight rhythm, like Latin jazz and fusion. But on the other hand, smooth jazz just doesn't really sound that jazzy. And ultimately, because this is music, it's our ears that should be making this decision, not our brains. So smooth jazz grew out of fusion, but is much less adventurous, more polished, and relies more on rhythm and grooves rather than improvisation. So is this really jazz? Have a listen to some of these artists and decide for yourself. Cool, thanks again guys, see ya.